Welcome, Ambassador David Mack. This is my second or third time interviewing you. You are a dear guest for the show, and you are a distinguished diplomat who served in frontline positions in the Middle East, like Iraq, Jerusalem, and United Arab Emirates. I'm going to start asking you about a local issue, which is, since you are graduated from Harvard University, how do you explain those protests happening in Columbia University and others, and what mess they are doing? I don't know how to describe this. You can tell us.
Well, younger Americans are much more attuned to the Palestinian cause and the need for justice for Palestinians than is the case with the older generation. President Biden is kind of like me. He's from a generation that grew up with a very rosy view of Israel, based on, I think of myself, based on Bible stories, based on what we'd heard about the awful horrors of the Holocaust and persecution of Jews in Europe, and based upon a novel by Leon Uris called Exodus, which was made into a movie that had millions and millions of people watching it. But in my case, in my senior year in college, I was taking, I had decided to study Arabic and Middle East countries, and I remember, this was in 1961, I remember the man who gave the lecture on the Israel-Palestine issues was a man named Nadav Safran. He came to us, he came to Harvard from Israel, but he was from the Egyptian Jewish community. And in 1948, he had volunteered to join the Israeli army, and they gave him a very important job at doing publicity for their armed forces. And they would take him into villages where he would have a loudspeaker, and he would broadcast, "You have to leave within 48 hours, or the same thing that will happen to you that happened in Deir Yassin," which was this horrible massacre where the Israeli forces had killed.
The conflict is so complicated right now, and many changes are happening in the Middle East, inside the Middle East society. Since you are a defender of the Palestinian cause, how do you see the reaction of Saudi Arabia supporting Palestine, especially Mohammed bin Salman? He was very clear about two-state solution and no mercy in that. So can you explain this policies of the Saudis?
Well, I would like to think that Mohammed bin Salman is very much affected by the views of his father, King Salman. I've never met Mohammed bin Salman, but I was in a couple of meetings with King Salman, and I was hugely impressed by the king. At the time he was the governor of Riyadh, because I could see he was very serious. He was a person who studied his briefs very well before our meetings, and I saw that he had a clear idea of not only the national interests of Saudi Arabia, but also the views of almost all Saudis, which were very pro-Palestinian. And I would like to think that Mohammed bin Salman has learned good lessons from his father.
Let's talk about the Abraham Accords. Do you think that these accords prevent countries that signed on these accords, like UAE, to defend Palestine? Or the UAE, as you know, you've been there, had also made some balance to conduct the conflict because they are against violence, against terrorism? How do you see this policy?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that the term Abraham Accords shows us something about U.S. politics and the difference between President Biden and former President Trump. Former President Trump has many faults, but one thing he's really good at is advertising. And actually, normalization of relations between Arab countries and Israel has been taking place for decades.
Yeah, since
I mean,
Georgian,
it never ended, for example, between
Oslo.
Morocco and Israel, and then in
Palestinians themselves, they signed those.
and after the successful Egyptian, partially successful Egyptian campaign against Israel that Anwar Sadat began in 1973, Sadat took advantage of the fact that he'd had a partial military victory until we pushed back with Henry Kissinger, and I was on Kissinger's staff for a while, and we supported an airlift of supplies to Israel, and then I saw Kissinger engage in this shuttle diplomacy between Egypt and Israel, and eventually forced a ceasefire on the Suez Canal. So Israel remained in control of the Sinai Peninsula. And after a few years, I mean, Sadat immediately transformed his military capability into a big diplomatic initiative.
Yeah.
He improved relations with us. He threw out the Soviet military advisors, and he began reaching out with our help to the Israelis.
Smart move.
Oh yes, and then he goes to the Knesset in 1977 and speaks at the Knesset, calling for détente between his country and Israel.
So he called for peace. The
Yes.
same as the UAE.
I remember.
Mohammed bin Zayed, no?
Yes, I remember. I was in Egypt or in Iraq at the time, and I remember my Arab diplomatic colleagues said their governments had been stunned by what Sadat did, but it was a brilliant and very far-sighted diplomatic move by Sadat, and it in the end, it was a great advance for Egyptian strategy. And that's partly because President Jimmy Carter immediately followed up the Sadat change in policy by inviting Sadat and Menachem Begin, sort of a right-wing Israeli prime minister, invited them to Camp David.
How do you see the UAE supporting the United States in combating terrorism, believing or adopting initiatives that called for peace and ceasefire?
Well, there's been certain advantages for the United Arab Emirates, and also for Bahrain and Saudi Arabia to a certain extent, in that in the UAE, their strategic problem is number one with Iran, not so much with Israel. They're a little bit removed from Israel, so they were very keen to have certain U.S. military supplies and U.S. intelligence and U.S. support in dealing with Iran. And so they basically traded that for making a diplomatic relationship with Israel. But I don't think it's changed the fact that the leaders of the UAE, and I know Mohammed bin Zayed personally, I think they still believe in justice for the Palestinians.
One more question in this regard. How do you evaluate the Biden administration dealing with Iranian regime right now? We see the conflict between Israel and Iran, the tennis ball of fire. So how this gonna end? And the Gaza, of course, escalation.
Although we don't have a formal, direct relationship with Iran, you can be sure that there are certain contacts taking place, both behind closed doors, but also through third parties like Oman and Qatar in particular. So there have been, there's a general understanding. I would say that both Iran and the U.S. do not want this Gaza war that Israel is largely responsible for, along with Hamas. They don't want the Gaza war to...
who began this war? It's Hamas?
Well, there are two parties to the Gaza war-Israel conflict. There are two parties who oppose a two-state solution, both of them. One of them is Hamas, and the second is the Prime Minister Netanyahu, and particularly his extreme right-wing coalition partners. And both of them are opposed to a two-state solution. Both of them want to have a single state that they control. So, and there are roughly, in this territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there are approximately 7 million Jews and 7 million Arabs, of Muslims, Christians, Druze. So it's two peoples on the same territory, and two peoples roughly equal in population. And that's why I think there is an attraction, including an attraction to President Biden, of this idea for a two-state solution.
I have a question about how to establish a consensus among both the Democratic and the Republican Party on ending this conflict we are talking about in Gaza.
Well, after the last 2 weeks and the deal that was made between President Biden, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who's a Republican, Speaker Johnson, the leader of the Senate, the majority leader of the Senate, Senator Charles Schumer of New York, who, by the way, is Jewish, but he has very much opposed the Netanyahu government in Israel. And he reflects a lot of views within the progressive American Jewish community.
Did they came to something together?
Yes, I would say that, you know, you asked me about what's going on the campuses. I would say there are various constituencies who are more or less in favor of Palestinian statehood. One are younger Americans. That's the university campuses. Another one are progressive Jewish leaders, and a third are people from various minority groups, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Black Americans.
How that will impact the elections, let's say?
Oh yes, well,
does have any effect on?
I think President Biden very much wants to cultivate his relations with our Arab partners, particularly Egypt and Jordan, but also the Arabian Peninsula, Arab, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. He wants to cultivate these relationships. And at the same time, he's a very experienced politician. He knows that he is facing a serious problem in getting Democrats who are part of his normal base to come out and actually vote. It's one thing to have a poll that says that most younger Democrats would prefer Biden to Trump, but unless they come and vote on our elections in November, it won't count. So he needs to take certain steps to get them to come out, and I'm convinced he will. He's very influenced by some senators of his party and other members of Congress. Right next door to us here, we have the state of Maryland with Senator Christopher Van Hollen, who is actually somebody that understands the Middle East far better than most members of Congress. Do you know where he was born?
I don't know.
He was born in Karachi, where his father, somebody a little older than me, but somebody I knew well, his father was on diplomatic assignment in Karachi, and that's where Chris Van Hollen, who now is a very influential senator from Maryland.
So do you think this issue will affect directly the campaign and the voters? And this is why, is there any chance for the Republican to come back to the House?
I don't know. I'm not such an expert on U.S. politics, and there's a lot, you know, there was a U.S. member of Congress who died of a heart attack the other day. The two sides are almost equal in terms of their numbers in the House of Representatives. And so, but I am convinced that the Biden administration is going to position itself to get as many Democrats and traditional supporters of Biden out to the polls as they can. And as I say, the one thing that former President Trump is really good at is advertising. This Abraham Accords, it's the sort of slogan you can put on a car bumper.
But it's changed the face of the Middle East.
It hasn't really. I think it's just a continuation of the normalization.
Expansion.
Yes, an expansion of the normalization. But normalization of relations has been going on for decades and decades. It was just the genius of Donald Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to come up with this slogan.
Thank you, Ambassador David Mack, for your thoughts. My audience will be happy to hear you. We are fully respectful to your good deeds, and have a good day. Thank you for coming again.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.